I want your best. Not her. The voice, sharp as shattered glass, cut through the hushed, antiseptic air of the hospital's executive suite. Every head in the room, from the flustered hospital administrator to the junior residents, turned towards the source of the pronouncement. Alistair Finch stood framed in the doorway, a monolith of bespoke tailoring and cold fury. His face, which might have been handsome, was etched with the kind of severe impatience that only immense wealth and profound grief could forge. His gaze was fixed on a single figure across the room. A nurse, her back to him, calmly checking the settings on an 4-drip connected to the frail old man in the bed. Mr. Finch, the administrator, a perpetually sweating man named Harrison, began scurrying forward. I assure you, Nurse Williams is our very best. She's the charge nurse on this floor. Exceptionally. I don't care what she is, Alistair interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. He took a step into the room, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the polished floor. The world he inhabited was one where his desires were preempted, his whims translated into immediate action. Dissent was a foreign language. My father is the primary benefactor of this wing. His name is on the plaque outside. When I say I want the best, I mean a doctor, a specialist, someone with credentials that justify the cost of this room. Not a nurse. He let the word hang in the air, weighted with disdain. The nurse in question, Imani Williams, finished her task. She did not flinch, did not turn. She simply pressed a button on the monitor, her movements economical and precise. A gentle, steady beep filled the silence, a counterpoint to the raging storm of Alistair's temper. Only then did she turn, and for the first time, Alistair saw her face. It was a calm, intelligent face, her dark eyes holding a depth that seemed to absorb his anger without reflecting it. She was a black woman, her hair pulled back neatly under her cap, her white uniform a stark, simple canvas against which his prejudice painted its ugly masterpiece. In his mind, 1,000 unspoken biases clicked into place. She was not what he had envisioned as the best. She was, therefore, unqualified. Mr. Finch, she said, her voice even and clear, betraying no hint of the insult she had just endured. Your father's vitals are stable. Dr. Albright has reviewed his chart and is satisfied with his current care plan. I am here to ensure that plan is executed flawlessly. Her competence was a rebuke. Her composure, an infuriating wall he couldn't breach. It only fueled his rage, a rage born of helplessness as he watched his once powerful father wither away in a hospital bed. I will not have it. Harrison, get her out of here. Find me someone else. Now. Harrison looked from Alistair's thunderous expression to Imani's unshakable calm and withered. Of course, Mr. Finch. Right away. Nurse, perhaps you could. Before he could finish, Alistair felt a strange tightness in his chest. A sudden, searing pain that shot down his left arm like a bolt of lightning. The edges of his vision began to blur, the sterile white room dissolving into a gray haze. He saw Imani's eyes widen, not in fear, but in sharp, immediate recognition. He saw her mouth form a word, a command to the others, but the sound was swallowed by a roaring in his ears. He stumbled, his hand clutching at his chest. The carefully constructed world of Alistair Finch, the billionaire CEO who commanded armies of lawyers and brokers, was collapsing. His legs gave way. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the woman he had just declared unqualified, the woman he had tried to banish from the room, moving towards him with the swift, certain grace of a savior. In that moment, as his life hung suspended by a thread, Alistair Finch had just made the biggest mistake of his life, a mistake that would not only save him, but utterly destroy the world he thought he knew. What happened next would unravel a web of deceit that ran to the very heart of the institution, and force a broken man to confront the poverty of his own soul. The world returned to Alistair Finch not as a gentle dawn, but as a series of disjointed, painful flashes. The rhythmic squeak of a shoe on linoleum, the sharp, clean scent of rubbing alcohol, a voice, calm and insistent, counting. 1, 2, 3 inch of pressure on his chest, immense and rhythmic, forcing the air from his lungs. He was an observer in his own body, a ghost tethered to a failing machine. He could feel the panic of the other people in the room, a frantic, chaotic energy that contrasted sharply with the steady control of the voice and the hands that worked on him. Those hands. He knew somehow they belonged to her, the nurse, Amani Williams, the woman he had dismissed with such cruel, casual arrogance. Now, his entire existence was in her grasp. The irony was a bitter acid in his throat. Through the fog of his fading consciousness, he registered the frantic words of others. Paddles. Charging. Clear. A violent jolt, a brutal electric convulsion that arched his back off the floor. And then, for a moment, nothing. Profound, terrifying silence. Had he died? Was this the empty void his father was slowly slipping towards? Then, another jolt. More pressure. The voice again, closer this time, right by his ear. Come on, Mr. Finch. Stay with us. Breathe. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. A command from someone utterly in charge, someone who would not accept failure. The third jolt was different. It felt less like an assault and more like a key turning in a rusted lock. A sputtering, desperate beat in his chest. Then another, stronger. A rhythm, weak but persistent. He gasped, a ragged, raw intake of air that burned his lungs. His eyes fluttered open, the ceiling lights above him a blinding white glare. Faces swam into view, a blur of masks and wide, fearful eyes. And then one face came into focus. Amani. She was leaning over him, a stethoscope to his chest, her brow furrowed in concentration. There was no triumph in her expression, no hint of "I told you so." There was only a profound, almost weary professionalism. She had faced down death and won, and now she was simply doing the paperwork. His rhythm is stabilizing, she announced to the room at large. Let's get him on a monitor and prepped for the cath lab. Page Dr. Carmichael. Now her orders were crisp, unquestioned. The room, which had been a whirlwind of panic, became a hive of efficient, purposeful activity under her direction. Mr. Harrison, the administrator, stood flattened against a wall, his face pale and useless. The junior residents moved with a new alacrity, their deference to her total. Alistair tried to speak, to form a word, an apology, a question, but his throat was raw. He could only watch as they transferred him to a gurney, his bespoke suit now cut open, his dignity stripped away, leaving him as vulnerable as the father he had come to watch over. As they wheeled him out of the room, his gaze locked with Amani's for a fleeting second. He saw in her eyes not pity, not anger, but a clear, unwavering assessment. She was looking at a patient, a problem to be solved, a life to be saved. He was no longer Alistair Finch, the billionaire. He was just a collection of symptoms, a failing heart. In the 6 minutes it had taken for his world to end and begin again, the power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been inverted with the brutal force of a defibrillator shock. He, who had wielded his power like a weapon, was now utterly powerless. And she, the woman he had deemed worthless, held the sum of his existence in her competent, steady hands. The injustice he had perpetrated had been answered not with vengeance, but with a life-saving grace that was more shaming than any rebuke. This was the true inciting incident, the moment the foundations of his life cracked, not from a heart attack, but from the seismic shock of his own profound and nearly fatal error. He was alive, but the man he had been just minutes before was dead and gone. A new man, raw and terrified, had been born on that polished floor, and his first lesson in this new life was one of utter, humbling dependence on the very person he had sought to destroy. Days bled into a monotonous, sterile cycle of beeps, tests, and hushed conversations outside his door. Alistair, confined to a bed in the very cardiac wing his family's money had built, was a caged lion. The initial terror had subsided, replaced by a gnawing, unfamiliar blend of gratitude and humiliation. Every time a nurse came in to check his vitals or adjust his medication, he searched their face, half hoping, half dreading it would be her. But Imani Williams seemed to have vanished. He was attended by a rotating cast of perfectly polite, perfectly professional staff, but she remained absent. He learned from a chatty orderly that she was still the charge nurse, a whirlwind of efficiency who managed the entire floor, but she never crossed the threshold of his room. Was she avoiding him? He couldn't blame her. He replayed the scene in his mind 1,000 times, the sheer, unvarnished ugliness of his words. Not her, the phrase echoed in the quiet of the night, a testament to a prejudice he'd never bothered to examine. He had always considered himself a pragmatist, a man who demanded excellence. But was that what it was? Or was it something darker, a reflexive dismissal of a woman who didn't fit his preconceived notion of authority? The answer shamed him. His father, in the room down the hall, was oblivious. His condition was stable but declining, a slow, inexorable fade. Alistair's visits were now short, conducted from a wheelchair, his own weakness a constant, galling reminder of his mortality. During one such visit, he overheard 2 nurses talking quietly in the hallway. "Did you hear? They're blaming Imani for the dispensary discrepancy. Again? That's the 3rd time this month. Harrison is going to have her head. It's not right. Everyone knows she's the most meticulous one here. She triple-checks everything. It's that new resident, Dr. Peterson. He's sloppy, but he's Harrison's nephew, so of course. Shoo, they'll hear you." The conversation snippet was a stone dropped into the placid pool of his recovery. A discrepancy. Blame. Harrison. The pieces clicked into place with an unsettling logic. The administrator had been humiliated that day, shown to be utterly useless in a crisis, while the nurse he was about to dismiss had taken complete control. Harrison was a man who thrived on sycophancy, on proximity to power. Alistair had wounded his pride, but Imani had exposed his incompetence. Driven by a new, urgent curiosity, Alistair began his investigation. The CEO in him, dormant for a week, reawakened. He still had his phone, his lifeline to the outside world, to the immense resources at his command. He made a call to the head of his personal security, a former intelligence officer named Marcus. "Marcus," he said, his voice low, "I need you to look into someone, a hospital administrator. Name's Harrison, and a nurse, Imani Williams. I want to know everything." Quietly, the information began to trickle in within hours, delivered in encrypted files to his tablet. Imani Williams' file was a portrait of quiet excellence. Top of her class at nursing school. Glowing recommendations from every hospital she'd ever worked at. She'd been promoted to charge nurse at this hospital in record time, a decision that, Marcus's report noted, had caused significant internal friction. She volunteered at a free clinic on her days off. She was the sole provider for her younger sister, who was in her final year of university. There was not a single blemish on her record. She was, by every objective measure, the best. Harrison's file, on the other hand, was riddled with red flags. He was deep in debt from a series of bad investments. There were whispers of gambling problems. His nephew, Dr. Peterson, had barely scraped through medical school and had been hired as a personal favor. Most damningly, Marcus uncovered a pattern. In the last 6 months, 3 other highly competent nurses who had crossed Harrison had been drummed out on trumped-up charges of medication mismanagement or insubordination. Alistair felt a cold knot of certainty form in his stomach. Imani wasn't just being avoided. She was being targeted. Harrison was trying to get rid of the one person who was a constant, living reminder of his own inadequacy. The woman who had saved Alistair's life and, in doing so, had exposed Harrison as a fraud. And Alistair himself had provided the weapon. His public, baseless accusation of her incompetence had given Harrison the perfect opening, the narrative he needed to begin his campaign of sabotage. The next day, the threat escalated. An official-looking memo was posted at the nurse's station, announcing a full audit of pharmaceutical dispensing procedures on Imani's floor, citing repeated and concerning inventory discrepancies. It was a public declaration of war. Alistair watched from his door, which he'd had the orderly leave ajar. He saw Imani read the memo, her face betraying nothing. But he saw the subtle straightening of her spine, the way her colleagues glanced at her with a mixture of sympathy and fear. They knew what this was. It was a witch hunt. Later that afternoon, he saw Harrison and his nephew, Peterson, in a heated, whispered conversation down the hall. Peterson looked nervous, gesturing wildly. Harrison clapped a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look avuncular but came across as menacing. He was pressuring the boy, using him as a pawn in his larger game. Alistair's heart, the very organ that had betrayed him, now pounded with a new, righteous anger. He had created this situation. His arrogance had lit the fuse. He had dismissed a woman's worth based on the color of her skin and the uniform she wore, and in doing so had made her vulnerable to a petty tyrant. The investigation was no longer about satisfying his curiosity. It was about rectifying an injustice he had helped create. He had to do more than just get better. He had to intervene. But how? A direct confrontation would be his style, but it might only make things worse for her. He needed proof. He needed to understand the full scope of Harrison's villainy. And for that, he needed to get closer to Imani Williams herself. The wall of professional distance she had erected was the first thing he would have to tear down. Alistair was discharged a week later, his doctors cautioning him to avoid stress. A piece of advice so absurdly contrary to his entire existence that he almost laughed. He left the hospital a physically weaker man, but one with a clarity of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The grief for his wife, which had shrouded him in an impenetrable fog of anger and isolation, had not vanished, but it was now joined by a new, sharp-edged feeling: responsibility. He ensured his father was receiving round-the-clock private care, effectively insulating him from the hospital's internal politics. But Alistair himself became a constant presence. He used his father's condition as the perfect excuse to haunt the halls of the cardiac wing, always watching, always listening. He traded his bespoke suits for simple, dark sweaters and trousers, trying to make himself less conspicuous, an observer rather than a commander. He was a ghost in the machine, and he saw everything. He saw Harrison publicly reprimand Imani for a chart notation that was, to Alistair's now-trained eye, perfectly standard. He saw her colleagues, fearful for their own jobs, grow more distant, leaving her isolated. He saw the sheer weight of the pressure she was under, yet she never buckled. Her care for her patients remained impeccable. She would hold the hand of a frightened elderly woman, explain a complex procedure to a worried family with infinite patience, and then turn to face another of Harrison's subtle attacks with that same unnerving calm. Her integrity was a fire that burned brighter the more they tried to extinguish it. He knew he couldn't approach her on the floor. It would be a public spectacle, and it would put her in an even more precarious position. He needed a private moment, a neutral ground. Marcus's report had given him the details of her life, including the small, unassuming apartment building she lived in. Felt like a violation, a step too far, but he was running out of options. One evening, after a particularly grueling day where he'd witnessed Harrison try to write her up for insubordination when she'd correctly challenged a medication order written by his nephew, Alistair knew he had to act. He drove himself, forgoing his usual chauffeur, and parked his understated but still absurdly expensive sedan down the street from her building. He didn't have a plan, only a desperate need to make her understand that he was not her enemy. He waited. An hour passed, then another. He watched people come and go, living their ordinary lives. He felt a pang of something he couldn't name, a longing for the simplicity he had always disdained. Finally, he saw her. She was walking from the bus stop, her shoulders slumped with an exhaustion that was visible even from a distance. She carried a small bag of groceries, and her head was bowed. The indomitable charge nurse was gone. In her place was just a tired woman carrying the weight of the world. He got out of the car and walked towards her, his heart, his newly repaired, fragile heart, pounding in his chest. "Nurse Williams," he said, his voice softer than he intended. Imani stopped dead. She looked up, and for the first time he saw the armor crack. Her eyes, usually so calm and composed, were filled with a deep, weary pain. When she saw him, That pain was instantly overlaid with a mask of wary hostility. "Mr. Finch, what are you doing here?" I needed to talk to you," he stammered, feeling like a clumsy teenager. All his corporate poise, his ability to command boardrooms, had deserted him. "We have nothing to talk about," she said, her voice flat. She tried to step around him. "Please," he said, moving to block her path. "Just 5 minutes. I know what Harrison is doing." That stopped her. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for deceit. "What do you know?" "I know the discrepancies aren't your fault. I know he's targeting you, and I know it's my fault. I gave him the ammunition that day, and I am so sorry." The apology, when it came, was not grand or eloquent. It was simple, raw, and utterly sincere. "What I said, it was inexcusable. It was born of fear and arrogance, and there is no justification for it." Amani stared at him for a long moment, the sounds of the city traffic filling the silence between them. He could see the conflict in her face, the instinct to distrust him, to protect herself, warring with the flicker of hope that she wasn't entirely alone in this fight. "An apology doesn't fix it, Mr. Finch," she said finally, her voice tight. "He's trying to destroy my career. He's trying to take away my license. This is my life. It's not a game for you to play and then feel sorry about." "I know," he said, his voice earnest. "That's why I want to help. Let me help you. I have resources. I can." "You can what?" she shot back, a spark of anger flaring in her eyes. "Buy my problem away? Throw your money at it until it disappears? That's how you fix things, isn't it? That's what you tried to do with my qualifications. Buy a better nurse. Some things can't be bought, Mr. Finch. My integrity is one of them." She pushed past him then, her shoulder brushing his, and walked towards the entrance of her building. He stood on the sidewalk, the sting of her words more painful than any scalpel. She was right. He had tried to solve a human problem with money and power, the only tools he knew how to use. He was about to turn, to retreat to the cold comfort of his empty mansion, when he saw her stumble. The grocery bag slipped from her grasp, its contents: an apple, a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, spilling across the concrete. She sank to her knees, not to pick them up, but as if the last of her strength had finally given out. He saw her shoulders begin to shake, and he heard a single choked sob. In that moment, she wasn't Charge Nurse Williams, the unflappable professional. She was just Imani, a young woman pushed to her breaking point. Alistair's heart broke. He walked over and knelt beside her, not touching her, but just being there. He slowly began to gather the scattered groceries. "My sister," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Her tuition is due. I promised her she would finish. If I lose my license, if I lose my job, everything I've worked for, she's worked for." He listened, his own grief rising to meet hers. He thought of his wife, of the promises he had made to her that he felt he was failing to keep. He understood, in a way he hadn't before, what it meant to fight for someone else. "I lost my wife 2 years ago," he heard himself say, the words coming out unbidden. "Her name was Eleanor. She was a teacher. She believed everyone deserved a chance, that you didn't judge people by their station, but by their character. Every day since she died, I've become less the man she loved and more." This, he gestured vaguely at himself, at the expensive car down the street, at the whole empty edifice of his life. "The day I met you, I was angry at the world because it took her from me, and I took that anger out on you. It was the ugliest, most shameful moment of my life, because you are exactly the kind of person she admired, the kind of person I used to want to be." He placed the carton of milk back in the bag. He looked at her, and she was looking back at him, the tears still tracking through the city grime on her cheeks. The hostility in her eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, shared vulnerability. They were two grieving people, kneeling on a dirty sidewalk, surrounded by the mundane wreckage of a dropped bag of groceries. "Let me help you fight him," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "Not with money. not as a billionaire buying a solution, but as a man trying to fix a wrong he helped create. "Let me be your ally." Amani looked at the hand he offered, not to help her up, but as a simple gesture of solidarity. For a long moment, she hesitated. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But the sincerity in his eyes, the shared pain of his confession, it reached her. Slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, Alistair." It was the first time she had used his name. It sounded less like an acceptance and more like a prayer. In that moment of shared vulnerability, a fragile, tentative alliance was forged. It wasn't about power or money anymore. It was about two people, broken in their own ways, deciding to stand together against the encroaching darkness. And for Alistair, it was the first step on the long, painful road back to the man Eleanor had loved. The alliance between Alistair and Amani solidified in the ensuing weeks, a clandestine partnership conducted through hushed phone calls and discreet meetings in quiet coffee shops far from the hospital. With Amani's reluctant trust, Alistair's investigation deepened, moving from a passive gathering of information to an active, targeted operation. She was his eyes and ears inside the hospital, while he was her unseen force on the outside. Amani began to notice things she had previously dismissed as simple sloppiness. Vials of high-demand painkillers, particularly opioids, going missing from the automated dispensary far more often than could be explained by simple human error. Patient charts, especially those handled by Dr. Peterson, Harrison's nephew, often had contradictory dosage information. When she flagged these issues through official channels, Harrison would bury the reports in paperwork or blame the hospital's outdated inventory system, promising an upgrade that never materialized. "He's covering for someone?" Amani told Alistair during one of their meetings, her brow furrowed as she studied copies of dispensary logs she had discreetly photographed with her phone. "Or he's part of it. The numbers don't add up. We're talking about thousands of dollars worth of medication vanishing every week. This isn't just about him trying to get me fired anymore. This is bigger." Alistair, using the full weight of his resources, tasked Marcus with a deep financial dive into Harrison and his known associates. The picture that emerged was grim and revealing. Harrison wasn't just in debt. He was making regular, large cash deposits into an offshore account, deposits that far exceeded his salary. Dr. Peterson, his nephew, had recently purchased a sports car that was impossible to afford on a resident's pay. "They're not just sloppy," Alistair said, his voice grim as he reviewed the data on his tablet. "They're criminals. They're stealing medication and selling it." The realization landed with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a simple case of workplace harassment or a vendetta against a competent nurse. This was an organized criminal enterprise operating from within the very institution meant to heal people. They were profiting from the pain of others, endangering patients by creating artificial shortages and falsifying records. The injustice was no longer personal. It was systemic, a cancer eating away at the heart of the hospital. This was the midpoint turn, the moment the stakes were elevated from Amani's career to the lives and safety of every patient in the building. Alistair felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. His father was a patient here. He himself had been a patient here. The institution he had propped up with millions of dollars in donations, the wing that bore his family's name, was being used as a front for a black market drug ring. "We have to go to the police," Amani said, her voice firm. "Not yet," Alistair countered, his mind already working, calculating angles, planning his strategy. The CEO was back in control, but this time his focus was not on profit, but on justice. "They have the system locked down. It's your word against a hospital administrator and a doctor. Harrison will paint you as a disgruntled employee making wild accusations to cover your own incompetence, the very narrative I helped him create. They'll bury us in an internal investigation. We need irrefutable proof. Something they can't deny." The weight of his past mistake settled on him again, heavier than before. He hadn't just put her job at risk. He had inadvertently provided the perfect cover for a criminal conspiracy. His public denunciation of her would be Exhibit A in any attempt she made to blow the whistle. They had to be smarter. They had to be more ruthless. That evening, a new layer of the conspiracy was revealed. Dr. Evelyn Reed, an older, semi-retired cardiologist who had been a friend of Alistair's father for decades, requested a meeting with him. She was a woman of unimpeachable integrity, one of the few people Alistair truly respected. They met in the hospital's quiet, disused library. "Alistair," she began, her face etched with worry. "I'm concerned. I've been reviewing some patient outcomes on the cardiac floor. There have been anomalies. Patients reporting inadequate pain relief, post-op complications that don't make sense. And it all seems to circle back to charts handled by young Peterson." She slid a file across the table. "This is Mrs. Gable. She had a routine stent procedure. Should have been home in 2 days. She developed a severe infection and nearly died. Her chart says she received a full course of a powerful, broad-spectrum antibiotic. But the lab work from her blood cultures tells a different story. The levels of the drug in her system were almost non-existent. It's as if she was given saline." Alistair felt a chill run down his spine. They weren't just stealing surplus medication. They were withholding life-saving drugs from patients and falsifying the records to cover their tracks. Mrs. Gable had nearly died because of their greed. How many others were there? "I brought my concerns to Harrison," Dr. Reed continued, her voice trembling with a quiet rage. "He told me I was overreacting. He said he would look into it, and then, yesterday, he tried to have Imani Williams, one of the finest nurses I've ever worked with, formally disciplined for questioning one of Peterson's medication orders for that very patient. He's using her as a scapegoat." This was the final piece of the puzzle. The full, monstrous scope of Harrison's evil was now laid bare. He was not just a thief. He was willing to let people die to protect his operation. And he was going to sacrifice Imani to do it. Alistair looked at the file, at the picture of the smiling, grandmotherly woman who had been brought to the brink of death. He thought of his own father, frail and vulnerable in his bed just a few floors up. He thought of Imani, fighting this battle alone for months, her reputation being systematically destroyed while she was trying to protect the very patients Harrison was endangering. The rage that filled him was cold and absolute. It was a righteous fury, utterly different from the petty, grief-stricken anger he had displayed on his first day here. This was no longer just about rectifying a personal mistake. This was a war, and Alistair Finch was about to bring his entire arsenal to the battlefield. He had to tear down the corrupt system, not just for Imani, but for Mrs. Gable, for his father, for every single patient whose life was in the hands of these monsters. His choice was made. He would no longer be a silent observer. He would become the instrument of their destruction. Alistair Finch made the choice in the quiet, dusty hospital library, surrounded by the ghosts of medical knowledge and ethical practice. He was done playing defense. He was done being reactive. It was time to go on the offensive. The plan that formed in his mind was audacious, risky, and leveraged every ounce of power and influence he possessed. He would not just expose Harrison. He would utterly dismantle his world, and he would do it in the most public way imaginable. "Dr. Reed," he said, his voice low and firm, "I need your help. I need access. And I need you to trust me." The first step was to protect Imani. He knew Harrison's next move would be to frame her conclusively. They had to work faster. He hired a team of forensic accountants, the best in the business, working them out of a temporary office he leased near the hospital. Under the guise of a philanthropic audit for a new donation, they began to dissect the hospital's financials, focusing on the pharmacy's procurement and billing records. His second move was more direct. He used Marcus and a team of private investigators. They were ghosts, equipped with the latest surveillance technology. Their target, Dr. Peterson. Alistair reasoned that the nephew was the weak link. He was young, foolish, and likely terrified. If he could be broken, the entire conspiracy would unravel. Meanwhile, Alistair had to keep playing his part. The concerned son, the recovering patient, the wealthy benefactor. He made a point of having a cordial lunch with Harrison in the hospital cafeteria. It was one of the most difficult things he had ever done. He sat there, making small talk about hospital efficiency and fundraising goals, while across the table sat a man who was willing to let patients die for profit. "I've been so impressed with the way you run things, Harrison," Alistair said, forcing a smile. "Especially your focus on accountability." Harrison preened, soaking up the praise. "Yes, well, standards are everything, Mr. Finch. You of all people understand that. Sometimes you have to trim the fat, get rid of underperforming assets. It's just good business." He said it with a pointed look towards the nurse's station, where Amani was coordinating the floor's response to a new admission. The message was clear. Alistair felt a surge of revulsion, but he held his composure. "Indeed. In fact, I'm considering making another significant donation. A new diagnostic wing. I'm thinking of announcing it at the annual Founders Gala in 2 weeks. I'd want you right there beside me, of course. A testament to your excellent leadership." It was the perfect bait. The Founders Gala was the hospital's biggest media event of the year, attended by the city's elite, politicians, and the press. The prospect of being publicly lauded by Alistair Finch was irresistible to a man like Harrison. His ego would blind him to the trap being set. While Alistair played the long game, Amani was walking a tightrope. Armed with the knowledge of the larger conspiracy, every shift became a minefield. She documented everything, keeping a secret log, cross-referencing patient charts with dispensary records, her heart pounding every time she had to interact with Peterson or Harrison. She was no longer just a nurse. She was an undercover operative in the most dangerous sense, gathering evidence while trying to protect her patients and her own back. One evening, Alistair received an urgent call from Marcus. "We've got him," Marcus said. "Peterson. He's meeting his contact." Marcus sent him a live video feed from a pinhole camera. Alistair watched on his phone as Peterson, looking pale and nervous, met a man in a dimly lit parking garage. He handed over a duffel bag. The other man handed him a thick envelope of cash. It was the smoking gun. They had the transaction on camera. They had the identity of the buyer, a known figure in the city's criminal underworld. But Alistair knew it wasn't enough. This would implicate Peterson, but Harrison was clever. He would disavow his nephew in a heartbeat, claiming he was shocked and appalled, painting himself as a victim of a rogue employee. Alistair needed to tie Harrison directly to the scheme. The breakthrough came from Dr. Reed. She had found a nurse who had been fired by Harrison 6 months prior, a woman named Sarah. Sarah had been afraid to speak out, threatened by Harrison into signing a non-disclosure agreement. But Dr. Reed, with her gentle persistence and sterling reputation, convinced her to talk to Alistair. They met in secret. Sarah, her hands trembling, told a story that mirrored Amani's almost exactly. She had noticed discrepancies, she had flagged them, and Harrison had begun a campaign to discredit her, ultimately firing her over a fabricated patient complaint. But she had one crucial piece of evidence. Before she was fired, she had overheard a phone call. She hadn't understood the significance at the time, but she had scribbled down a few phrases she'd heard Harrison say. "The shipment is light. The price is firm. My contact guarantees," and she had a number, the private number Harrison had called. It was the final link. Marcus traced the number. It didn't belong to the street-level dealer Peterson was meeting. It belonged to a shell corporation, which, after the forensic accountants peeled back 3 layers of obfuscation, was found to be owned by a holding company whose sole director was Harrison's wife. He had it all. The financial records, the video surveillance, the witness testimony, the phone records. The net was complete. The full weight of his choice to intervene, to risk his reputation and deploy his resources, had borne fruit. He had committed himself fully to Amani's cause, and in doing so had uncovered a rot that threatened to consume the entire hospital. Now all that was left was to spring the trap. The Founders Gala was in 3 days. It would not be a celebration of Harrison's leadership. It would be his public execution. The night of the Founders Gala arrived, cloaked in the deceptive glamour of philanthropy. The hospital's grand ballroom was a sea of black ties and glittering gowns, the air thick with the murmur of polite conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses. At the center of it all, standing beside the mayor, was Mr. Harrison, his chest puffed out, his face flushed with triumph. He was the man of the hour, the administrator who had secured a legacy-defining donation from the city's most formidable billionaire. Alastair moved through the crowd, a shark in calm waters. He nodded to acquaintances, exchanged pleasantries, played the part of the gracious benefactor. But beneath the calm exterior, his nerves were stretched taut. He had spent the last 48 hours in a whirlwind of preparation, coordinating with Marcus, the legal team, and even a trusted contact in the police department who was standing by. Everything was in place. His gaze found Imani. He had insisted she attend, sending a simple, elegant dress to her apartment with a note. "I need you to see this." She stood near the back of the room, looking uncomfortable but resolute. Her presence was essential. This was not just his victory. It was their victory, and more importantly, it was her vindication. When their eyes met across the room, he gave her a subtle, reassuring nod. She returned it, a silent acknowledgement of the trust that had been forged between them in the crucible of the past few weeks. But just as Alastair was preparing to make his way to the stage, he received a text from Marcus. It was a single, chilling sentence. "They've made their move. Security is escorting Imani out. Harrison planted drugs in her locker." Alastair's blood ran cold. The all-is-lost moment. He had underestimated Harrison's ruthlessness. The man wasn't just waiting to be exposed. He was making a final, desperate move to discredit his primary accuser before she could ever speak. He was trying to frame Imani not just for medication theft, but for possession, a criminal charge that would destroy her life forever. He saw it happening at the far end of the ballroom. Two hospital security guards, their faces grim, were speaking quietly to Imani. Harrison was watching from his place of honor, a small, cruel smile playing on his lips. He thought he had won. He had timed it perfectly. By the time anyone realized what was happening, Imani would be in handcuffs, her credibility shattered, and any accusation she made would sound like the desperate fantasy of a criminal. For a single, heart-stopping moment, Alastair felt a wave of despair. Had he pushed too hard? Had his grand, dramatic plan backfired, leaving Imani to pay the ultimate price? The old Alastair might have hesitated, might have tried to handle it quietly, to pull strings behind the scenes. But he was not the old Alastair. He strode purposefully across the room, his path intersecting with Imani and the guards just as they were about to lead her away. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the nearby chatter. "Mr. Finch, sir," one of the guards said, clearly flustered. "This is an internal matter. We've had a report of contraband found in Nurse Williams' locker." "I see," Alastair said, his voice dangerously calm. He turned to Imani. Her face was pale, but her eyes,